I remember that because it was something along the lines of, Rafi, we have a data center deal in Kansas City and an old printing press.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I kind of went, okay.
Every capital stack looks clean on paper until the pressure hits. I'm Bali Kumar, COO of Pace Loan Group, and this is the Chameleon of the Capstack, a podcast about real deals, real decisions, and how CPACE gets used when certainty matters most in commercial real estate. Today, we're joined by Pace Loan Group CEO Rafi Golberstein and Senior Vice President Robbie Pinkas. Data centers are critical infrastructure with unforgiving capital requirements. This episode explores scale, certainty, and financing in a rapidly evolving asset class.
All right, so Robbie, you had kind of a big deal that just closed, a little bit, an out-of-the-box deal. Let's kind of rewind to the beginning about how this got to you and how we got from sort of this concept of a data center deal to closing the data center deal.
Two things I think came together for the original sourcing of this. One, I had, at the beginning of last year, started kind of a search for a data center opportunity. I knew that they were a hot topic. They still are. And I just had this gut instinct that Pace and data centers would be a good combination because, as you know, as everyone knows, it's in the news, data centers consume a ton of electricity. So efficiency really matters. Also, 2 years ago now, 2024, I closed what was then the largest deal in Missouri, the Gateway Studios deal. And I think because of that, I was approached by this company, Patmos, who had an opportunity in Kansas City, Missouri, to convert a former printing press into a data center. And they reached out to me because of the track record we'd established in Missouri. And the more I learned about the deal, the more conviction I had that this would be a great Pace financing opportunity.
I remember that because it was something along the lines of, Rafi, we have a data center deal in Kansas City and an old printing press.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I kind of went, okay. Let's unpack that a little bit because my knowledge in data centers is super limited. I've done a few in my career, but I think if I can recall correctly, they were all ground up credit tenant type deals. And this was just kind of the opposite of that. It was not ground up and it was not credit tenant, with a fairly young developers that are behind the wheel. But I think what the first thing that we sort of latched onto was like there's actual real estate value to the property. And we didn't have to take development ground up risk on the deal because it was built, it was in a major metropolitan area. Like there was some intrinsic worst case scenario value to the real estate if this whole thing just imploded.
Yes. And they're more importantly, even for at least the data center component than the intrinsic value, was the power allocation that the building had. Because as a printing press, it consumed a huge amount of power. And so I think the local utility had 25 megawatts that was pre-allocated to this building. It wasn't currently being drawn, so there was a lot of work that needed to be done to kind of get the project back up to its former draw. But that was what I saw the real opportunity as, because the biggest limiting factor to data centers is availability of power, especially if it's grid power, which is definitely the most desirable because it's the most reliable. But most of these big data centers that are ground up credit tenant projects are being built kind of in the middle of nowhere where land and power are cheap, and the power is often self-generated. Like for a lot of these data centers are power plant data center projects. And we had kind of the power in the bag from this one, which made everyone's life a lot easier. We ended up having a little bit less power than we originally thought. I think when we signed up the deal, we were optimistic they would get upwards of 35 megawatts of power from Evergy, but they ended up with 25, which is still nothing to kind of sneeze at. And it made the conversion much easier because, yeah, we had to put in, new electric. We had to upgrade the chillers. We had to kind of tie into the local cold water utility. But there was much less construction risk than there would be in a typical data center deal.
For sure. And a typical deal takes to get to like a typical kind of ground up Greenfield site deal. I mean, that could be years,
at least years, at least 2 years, I think, between the permitting, either like getting the allocation from the utility, which is like a complicated path to power process, or building a power plant and then building a data center. Like, I think if you could do that in 2 years, people would be applauding you.
Right.
I think it's typically more like 3+. And these people delivered a 25 megawatt data center in less than 12 months.
But the plot thickens, right? Because there's more to the story that we haven't sort of unraveled yet, which is that they didn't actually own the property. No. And so they had taken, like, my recollection here, you'll be better to explain this, but is something along the lines of they had, the developer, Patmos, had stumbled upon this site, realized, to your point, Robbie, that it had already been built for power that has just never been used since the paper press went under. The owner of the asset was, not in the field of data centers and didn't quite understand what they were literally sitting on. And so they were able to take control of the asset through some structure.
Yeah, so this is the sponsor's like first big project, but they are clever. And as part of negotiating a lease for the space, they negotiated a purchase option, understanding the value that they would create if they could build and own a data center. And the owner at the time was a local family who had purchased the property from, the bankrupt Kansas City Star. And I think they had a gut instinct that there was some opportunity here, but their business is not data centers. Like, they're kind of, opportunistic real estate investors. And what ultimately was created was a partnership of sorts, because yes, Patmos is now the owner of this data center, but they negotiated a fairly favorable purchase from the prior owner, and the prior owner, through a subsidiary of theirs, also provided a lot of the electric subcontracting work. So it is one of my favorite stories where like everyone kind of wins. But yeah, they kind of rewinding, they signed a lease, they had this purchase option, they had a significant upfront investment from some of their tenants. And so they were able to start the conversion process without the PACE funds. And we came in sort of halfway through the project, provided money to complete the project, but we also provided funds that allowed them to effectuate the purchase of the property by sort of using a portion of the retroactive proceeds. And yeah, I don't know, it's just a really great story where all the kind of puzzle pieces fit.
And tell me more about how you got the puzzle pieces to fit, right? PACE is very nuanced and complicated, and I'm sure the developer didn't really understand PACE as well as they understood, I need X amount of dollars.
No, I was the one who was like, you can use PACE to buy this property. Yeah. Like, once I found out how much money had been invested and what that money was spent on, it became clear to me that there were sufficient retroactive proceeds to make the down payment necessary to buy the property. And the rest of the sale was, seller financed. So, I think I'm a creative thinker, and I know PACE pretty well. And so the more I kind of learned about this story, the more I started to put together the general architecture of the deal.
I mean, and that like debunks the whole concept of like, PACE is not complicated, and even if it is, you'll figure it out for you.
Yeah, it's not complicated, but it's nuanced and it's flexible, and that makes PACE hard to sell sometimes because it can take a lot of different shapes. But I think if you know the product well, it can be used as an advantage, like in this case where the more I started to learn, the more I became confident that I was like, oh, no, this is what we're going to do. Like, we're going to provide a PACE loan. You're going to use the retroactive portion to buy the building. We're going to use the sort of forward-looking portion to complete the build out. And then you're going to own a really valuable asset, and we're going to be your partner in it.
So let's talk some numbers, though, because I think we got to put it in context. So the PACE assessment that we wrote was $100 million flat.
Flat. Yep.
So $100 million assessment on a roughly 440,000 square foot building. The square footage, even though I always think about it, is largely irrelevant because the data center is all about megawatts and power access. What had, the use of those monies were basically, and I'm rounding here, but about $20 million of that went toward closing on the purchase of the building, right? Yep. Because our sponsors here had limited liquidity, so they had to use our money to purchase it. And, a large portion of the balance of the money went into a reserve to be drawn out sort of in the immediate future for the continued and finalization of the build out for their two tenants.
Yes. And we also have, a 2-year capitalized interest reserve.
Sure.
And sufficient contingency, because I think that this is a relatively de-risked project and that they've already built out half of it, and the remaining build out will be done, by April.
Hugely de-risked. I mean, that's why we were so interested, was that there was no ground up construction aspect. At the time we signed it up, they had one tenant that had signed.
And now they have two. They're actually over capacity.
Right. So the deal's gotten better over time. But when we first saw it, it was de-risked so that there was no construction risk, but there was still some risk of, will they get the thing fully leased up? And through the course of, the underwriting and the due diligence and the PACE audit, which was in and of itself a process, they really nailed it.
Yeah. And they, the timing is everything. And I think they really timed this well, because the new tenant that they brought in was at a significantly higher rent than the existing tenant, which was at still a market rent. So, or at least what was then market. I think the market really moved over the course of the year. And, I think that there's an opportunity to do a subsequent PACE assessment, because I know, to your point, it's a 400,000 square foot building. I think the data hall is maybe 100,000 square feet. And, I've been in it. It's maybe 30% used. So if they can get more power from Evergy, or, build some sort of on-site power generation, I think that there's the opportunity to provide subsequent PACE financing to kind of get this up to whatever its maximum capacity is.
Yeah. And I think for entrepreneurial data center developers out there, this is a super interesting case study. And just to kind of spell it down to the basic building blocks, basically the sponsors identified a building that had power. They didn't have the capital to buy the building, so they leased it. While they had leased it, they effectively subleased it to a tenant.
Yep.
Because it was an existing building that was ready to roll more or less immediately, their tenants were willing to contribute significant amounts of money toward their build out and rack system, like tens of millions of dollars, because for them it was all about speed to market. Like I can either give the sponsor $30 million to build out the space, or I can wait 3 years for someone to go develop a Greenfield site. So definitely that's money well spent. And so they had spent the sponsor spent the early days of their lease effectively subleasing it, using the money from the tenants to build it out. And then when it came time to close on the purchase, they were like, well, we don't have the cash to close on the purchase. We'll use retroactive CPACE to create a liquidity event to give us the money to buy.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a replicable strategy. I don't know how many of these opportunities there are. I don't think it's thousands, because there are a lot of unique elements, like an empty building in a metro area with a significant underutilized power allocation.
Connected to a carrier hotel.
Yeah, connected to a carrier hotel. This is like the archetype, but there are certainly other opportunities out there, and I am excited to go find them. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Chameleon of the Capstack from PACE Loan Group. For more information about CPACE and PACE Loan Group, visit paceloangroup.com and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.